Does the front of your hip feel tight, achy, or even painful? You're not alone. Tight hip flexors are an issue caused by too much sitting, overtraining, or poor movement patterns. But here's the good news. In this video, I'm going to take your hip flexors through my functional mobility formula, a step-by-step approach to not only stretch your psoas, but to restore lasting mobility and eliminate pain. Stick with me, and by the end of this video, you'll know the exact routine you need to do to fix the front of your hip pain for good. So let's dive in. The first R is recognize. We want to recognize where our tension or discomfort is, which for the hip flexor or the psoas is going to be right on the front side of the hip here. Then we want to recognize a couple movements that cause our discomfort. So the first easy one would be going into a deep squat position. Do you feel anything there? Or another good test is sitting at the edge of a bench or a bed and hug one knee to your chest as you rock backwards. In doing so, is this thigh parallel to the ground? If it's stuck up here, then you really know your psoas may be the problem. The next R is reduce tension. So we're going to stretch out the muscle fibers to loosen them up. And my favorite move for the psoas is a triplanar hip flexor stretch. So in this half kneeling position, you're going to kind of tuck your tail between your legs or posteriorly pelvic tilt. And then we're going to go into 3 planes of motion. The first one, we're going to go into that sagittal plane, and then we're going to go into that coronal plane, and then that transverse or that rotational plane. We're just going to cycle through a good 5 times in each direction. That way we're hitting all the fibers of the hip flexor and not just the front fibers that everybody does. From the other angle, I'm driving forward, reaching overhead, reaching across the body, and then rotating across the body. And if you've never tried this, it's going to take your hip flexor stretch to the next level. The third R is restore joint range of motion. So this is where our mobility exercises come into play. So if psoas is tight, you're typically going to be more in an anteriorly pelvic tilted position, and you're already going to be in more of a hip flexion range of motion. So after loosening up the tissues on the front side, we're going to restore that hip extension range. So similar setup to the hip flexor stretch, but I'd widen my stance. Instead of tucking my tail, I'm actually going to dump my pelvis forward. I'm going to push my pelvis forward and really get into a deep hip flexor stretch. With this one, it's going to be a little bit more pinpoint right over the joint. So if you have any discomfort, just touch it, come right back, and then each repetition, you're trying to go further and further into that range. From the front, wide stance, dump forward, drive forward, really feel that pinpoint stretch right here. The next R is reinforce, because we want to reinforce the changes we just made with a strength and stability exercise. So for this, we're going to lie on our back, bring our legs up in this 90-90. From here, you're going to think about gluing your low back to the ground. So we want to fixate the spine and then tap that heel, and that's going to eccentrically elongate that muscle. Not only is this a good core exercise similar to a dead bug, but we're really focusing on elongating that hip flexor. So I feel this in my core, but also in the front of my hips, especially after I just loosened it up with the first 2 moves. And lastly, we want to reassess. So we recognize discomfort in the front of the hip. So did we get symptom reduction? If so, we know we're heading down the right path. Or the movements we recognize cause discomfort, are those easier, smoother, or can we get deeper into them before they hit your symptoms? If yes, then we know this is a solid 3-pack of movements to add to your routine.